Hi, thank you for joining me for another episode of Hydroponics Daily. I'm Dr. Russell Sharp. Today's episode is about the history of hydroponics. And as I said in the last episode, I don't believe that hydroponics started with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, as is often cited. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were a audacious and early attempt at horticulture, but they weren't true hydroponics. They were irrigation of raised beds. So they took water from the Euphrates and used advanced pumps for the time that pulled the water up and then fed beds, and they grew plants in them. But the grow media they used was almost certainly soil. So we can't say it was soilless cultivation. It was hydroponics. They certainly wouldn't have been using fertilizers as we know them today. And so I wouldn't consider this to be hydroponics. And really, there are lots of further early on examples of potential sources of where hydroponics started that really we don't consider to be true hydroponics. So Francis Bacon, a famous scientist and author from the 17th century, he talks about growing plants in water or soilless cultivation, but this is just as like an experiment. And there were further experiments throughout the 17th century. A guy called John Woodward looked at growing at spearmint, and he found that the spearmint grew better in contaminated, less pure water than purer water. Other scientists like Wilhelm Knopp, Julius von Sachs in the 19th century, they found different chemical elements that plants needed by growing plants in water in solution. However, they were never producing crops from them. They were not creating a yield. And so this is really not hydroponics as we know it. There was no recirculatory pump. There was no fertilizer, fertigation, and there was no crops being made. They couldn't get them through to producing a whole crop. And then when hydroponics was really invented as an art form, as a method of crop production, that was in the 1930s. And that was by a professor called William Frederick Gericke. And he was at the University of California, and he showed that you could grow plants, really tall tomato crops, with mineral solutions. And so he is considered by myself and many others to be the founding father of hydroponics. He also incidentally invented this thing called phosphorus priming, where certain seeds like maize, he found that maize required lots of phosphorus in its seedling stage, and they could absorb lots of the phosphorus they need in that early stage, get them through to harvest. And that was the inspiration for one of our other products called Phosphorus Liberator. A phosphorus liberator is used in arable crops in soil. And without his research and me knowing about his research, that product would not exist. It's probably our best-selling product as of this year. So I've got William Gericke to thank from the 1920s. And then there were some early hydroponic farms about 10 years later. One notable one was on the island of Ascension. So that's a British overseas territory, but it had an American Army base. And the Americans brought over their technology from the University of California and elsewhere and set up a hydroponic farm, probably one of the first, if not the first commercial hydroponic farms that fed the US servicemen on the Ascension. And Ascension's got really bad soil. To this day, they rely on hydroponics for their fresh produce. And then in the 1960s, a guy called Alan Cooper developed the nutrient film technique. I think that might have been in the UK as well, but we have to check on that. But yeah, that's where the history of hydroponics comes from. Really came into its own in the 1970s. And that's where large-scale production in greenhouses and real commercialization occurred in Europe. And then following on from that, in the 2010s, that's where LED lights came in. And then we've seen vertical farming develop from that. Without LED lights, we wouldn't have vertical farms. They would just get too hot. Imagine layer upon layer, a lasagna of sodium lamps in a warehouse. It would just go on fire with the heat. So LED lights were crucial for that. Interestingly, going back to Ascension, there is a report online about how hydroponics has developed on Ascension, and actually it's gone backwards. And the farm, they keep on setting up farms, and then they've had trouble with spider mites particularly getting infested. Obviously, supply of raw materials, things like rock wool, and they're relying on nutrient film technique, and now they've gone back and they were using a closed system. Now they've gone to a run to waste system, which in an island with fragile ecosystem might not be the best option. But when they don't have supplies of sterilization, UV, ozone, sterilization for circulatory systems is going to struggle, because you're just going to get buildup of basically biological material and pests and diseases in that stream unless you can somehow sterilize it. So, and also it's not a closed greenhouse they're using on Ascension Island. They use sort of like mesh tents because it's a tropical system. So it's really interesting. There's a report by Lee Morris for the Blue Marine Foundation, and basically the Royal Mail, the postal service in the UK, they stopped their ship that serviced Ascension Islands, even though it's a British overseas territory and it's a volcano in the middle of the ocean. And so they've had to go back to hydroponics, and they're desperately scrambling to get hydroponics on there because they've got a real problem with the health of the native population and the population there. Type 2 diabetes and obesity is a big problem. Obviously relying on, preserved processed foods and things like this. So it's not just the American servicemen that needed hydroponics on Ascension. So as I say, hydroponics, it didn't start with the Babylonians, but it's certainly pump and irrigation part of hydroponics did. It didn't start in the 1960s, the 17th century with Francis Bacon and people like that. But that's where they looked at, they were able to experiment with soilless cultivation and soilless growth of plants. But it really started with Professor Gericke at the University of California in the 1930s. And if you've got any information about Professor Gericke, more than what I've said, then please do get in touch. It seems like an interesting fella, and he contributed a lot to plant science, and a lot that I've got to be thankful for, because he invented hydroponics and he invented phosphorus priming. And that's two areas where we sell a lot of products into. So that's been Hydroponics Daily for today, the history of hydroponics. See you again tomorrow for another episode. Remember to follow this series so that you don't miss an episode. Thank you very much.